The Lost Violin. A fictional sad story. For many years, an old man named Baisal lived alone in a quiet mountain village. The only thing he truly loved was his old violin. His father had given it to him as a gift before leaving for war. Baisal never saw him again. The violin became his companion, his confidant. Every morning, Baisal would sit on an old wooden bench, facing the mountains, and play gentle, sorrowful melodies. The villagers often said, "Baisal's violin is crying again." The tunes were always full of longing, memory, and melancholy. Baisal had never married the woman he once loved. Aigul had moved to another village and never returned. Every time he played the violin, one day as summer slowly turned to autumn, Baisal took his violin and walked to the base of the mountain, just like always. But this time, there was something different in his steps, slower, heavier. He played one final melody, tears streaming down his cheeks. That day, he vanished without a trace. The next morning, the villagers searched for him, but all they found was the violin, gently resting on the old bench. Beside it lay a small folded note. "My heart has lived with Aigul all these years. My violin was my voice. Now let it rest too. Baisal." Since that day, the bench became a quiet memorial. Villagers placed flowers there. The violin was given to the years later. A young music teacher named Amira arrived in the village school. She had moved from the city, tired of the noise and disconnection. On her first day, she saw the old violin displayed in a glass case. Curious, she asked the headmaster about it. He told her Baisal's story. That night, Demira couldn't sleep. Something about the story haunted her. The name Aigul echoed in her mind. It was the name of her grandmother who always refused to talk about her youth, who had once told Demira as a child, "If you ever hear the sound of a violin in the mountains, that's someone remembering me." Shocked, Demira went through her grandmother's old letters. She found one, yellowed with time, never sent. It read, "My dear Baisal, I waited by the river that evening, but you never." Demira, trembling, brought the letter to the school and asked to borrow the violin. That evening, under the same mountain sky, she sat on the old bench and played for the first time. Villagers gathered silently, hearing the melody return, soft, haunting, and filled with the echo of a love that once lived. And in that moment, it felt as if Baisal had returned. Not in body, but in song. The reunion of two souls. As the final note faded into the crisp mountain air, Demira closed her eyes. A soft wind passed over the bench, and she could almost hear footsteps in the grass behind her, the sound of someone who once walked this same path, day after day, with a violin in hand and sorrow in his heart. She opened her eyes. No one was there, but something in the days that followed. Strange things began to happen. The violin, once silent in its case, started to produce faint vibrations when someone mentioned Baisal or Aigul. Some said it was the wood, others said it was the wind. But those who believed knew the truth. The violin remembered. Demira decided to hold a concert at the school. She invited the whole village and titled the event, "The Melody That Waited." That night, Under lantern light and surrounded by the whispers of pines, she told the full story of Baisal, of Aigul, of the letter never sent, and the music that bridged decades of silence. At the climax of her tale, she played Baisal's melody once more. Only this time, something magical happened. As her bow moved last song, and then it faded. After the concert, an old woman approached Demira. She had been silent the whole time. With trembling hands, she held out a faded photograph, a young Aigul beside a young Baisal, smiling, standing by that very bench. "I knew them," the woman whispered. "They loved each other more than the world allowed. But music kept them connected." The violin's legacy months passed. Demira stayed in the village. The violin was no longer locked in a case, but became part of every lesson, every song, and every memory. Children composed their own music, and each time they played, it was as if Baisal's spirit nodded in approval. The school added a new sign by the bench, "Where music waits, the whispering forest." Winter came early that year. The mountains were dusted with snow by late October, and the trees that lined the path to the old bench stood silent, cloaked in white. But even as the cold deepened, the villagers continued to visit the bench. Some brought candles, others brought poems, and some, like young Akul, a quiet student with a wild imagination, simply came to listen. One evening, Akul slipped away from his home, violin in hand. He had never played in front of anyone before, but something inside him, maybe the same force that had once guided Baisal, pulled him to the bench under the starlight. He placed the violin beneath his chin and whispered, "I don't know your song, Mr. Baisal, but I brought my own." And then with trembling fingers, kind had awakened. He looked around and saw flickers of light, tiny orbs dancing between the branches. He wasn't afraid. He played louder. When he finished, a voice, soft, male and warm, spoke near his ear. "Play again, little one. You have the heart for it." Akul turned sharply. No one was there, but his violin string was glowing, not hot, not bright, just alive. He ran home, his heart pounding. The next day, Demira found him sketching the trees. "Miss," he said, "I think the forest listened to me. I think the violin is alive." She didn't laugh. She nodded slowly. "You're not the first to feel that way." Now children weren't just learning about Baisal in books. The word of this enchanted violin reached neighboring villages. A documentary crew visited, curious skeptics. They brought cameras, sound equipment, and long questions, but none of their technology could explain what they witnessed one night. When Demira played the original melody, the one Baisal had written, one of the trees bloomed, despite the snow, a single pink blossom on a bare branch. That image made headlines. People called it a miracle. Scientists debated, but Demira only smiled. "It's not science," she said. "It's memory." With the news of the blooming tree in winter, journalists, tourists, and curiosity seekers began arriving in the village, some with notebooks, some with expensive cameras, and others with little more than wide eyes. But the violin didn't respond. No breeze, no lights, no blossoms. It was as if the violin or perhaps Baisal's spirit, had gone silent. Demira stood on the school steps one evening, watching as strangers trampled the snowy grass. Her students no longer visited the bench. Some were afraid. Others had simply lost the feeling that once pulled them there. "I think we broke something," Akel whispered beside her. "The music doesn't trust them." She nodded. Maybe the music needs to hide again. That night, Demira gathered the children. In the warmth of the old school, with the fireplace burning low, she made a decision. "The world is loud," she said, "but music like Baisal's only lives where hearts are quiet. We have to protect it." They agreed to hide the violin. There, wrapped in soft cloth and sealed inside a wooden case, they left the violin with a simple carving on the door. Not for fame, not for fortune, for love. Akel's discovery. The village quieted over time. The tourists left. The journalists moved on to newer stories. Winter passed into spring, and wildflowers returned to the mountain paths. But something stirred in Akel. One day, he returned to the old cabin and opened the case. As he lifted the violin, something fluttered out from beneath the strings, a tiny folded paper, yellowed with age. He opened it slowly. It was a handwritten musical composition, not just notes, but a message embedded in the music, like a code. And at the top, in delicate script, "To whoever finds this, the final melody is unfinished. Complete it, and you will understand why I never left the mountain. B." Akel stared at the notes. They were hauntingly beautiful, but they ended abruptly, mid-line. It was as though Baisal had written his soul into the music, like a code. And at the top, in delicate script, "To whoever finds this, the final melody is unfinished. Complete it, and you will understand why I never left the mountain. B." Akel stared at the notes. They were hauntingly beautiful, but they ended abruptly, mid-line. It was as though Baisal had written his soul into the music, then stopped, waiting for someone to finish it. Akel took the violin, heart pounding, and returned to the school. For weeks, he worked on it. Days bled into nights. His fingers blistered. He heard melodies in his dreams. He wept sometimes, feeling grief he couldn't explain. Until finally, on a rainy spring morning, he added the final 4 notes. When he played the full composition, the wind howled outside, and then silence. Then a voice, Baisal's, spoke in his mind. "Thank you. You heard what others couldn't. My story is now whole, and so is yours." When Akel finally played the complete melody in front of his classmates and Demira, the school grew completely still. Even the youngest students, usually restless, sat frozen as if the air itself was listening. As he drew the bow across the final note, a gust of wind blew open the windows, and petals, bright pink and unfamiliar, drifted inside like snow. The petals weren't from any tree in the region. They matched the blossom that had bloomed months ago, the one from the night of Demira's concert. Demira, trembling, brought the letter to the school and asked to borrow the violin. That evening, under the same mountain sky, she sat on the old bench and played for the first time. Villagers gathered silently, hearing the melody return, soft, haunting, and filled with the echo of a love that once lived. And in that moment, It felt as if Baisal had returned. Not in body, but in song. The reunion of two souls. As the final note faded into the crisp mountain air, Demira closed her eyes. A soft wind passed over the bench, and she could almost hear footsteps in the grass behind her, the sound of someone who once walked this same path, day after day, with a violin in hand and sorrow in his heart. She opened her eyes. No one was there, but something. They agreed to leave it there, untouched. The music had been heard, the story had been told, and the soul inside the violin, Baisal's love, sorrow, and hope, had found its way home. The bench beneath the tree remained, though, and people still came. Not for fame, not for miracles, but to sit in silence and feel the echoes of something eternal. Years passed. Akil grew up and became a composer. His music, shaped by mountain winds and childhood whispers, carried traces of the lost melody. Audiences across the country felt something ancient in his songs, a sadness they couldn't name, and a peace they didn't expect. One day, Demira, now older, slower, and still living in the village, received a letter from him. It read, "Miss Demira, I've been asked hundreds of times what inspired my music. I always smile and say, a violin that once cried and a teacher who listened. But you and I know the truth. Some stories don't end. They echo, and some hearts, like Baisal's, never die. They become song." She pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "Thank you, Baisal. Thank you for trusting us, where love remains." Long after Demira passed away, a new teacher arrived in the village. On her first day, a child brought her a drawing, a glowing violin floating among trees, with two smiling spirits watching over it. "What's this?" the teacher asked. The child grinned. "That's Baisal, and that's his Igul. They never left. They just became part of the music." The teacher didn't know the story. Not yet. But that night, when the wind rustled through the windows and carried the faintest sound of strings, she lit a candle, sat by the old bench, and listened.